Thanks for joining us tonight for the inaugural reading of the 2020 academic year and for our first ever UNCG Creative Writing Program Zoom reading. Because many of you now have had the benefit of learning directly from Derek Palacio, and more of you have had the chance to hear him read and discuss his work this past spring, we already know that we're in for a phenomenal evening that's going to set a high bar for the rest of the season. But it's convention when we host these readings to provide a little additional background on our guest readers, things like the highlights of their professional life, their accomplishments and accolades, that kind of thing. So I asked Derek for a recent bio so I could put together this introduction, and this is what he sent me. Derek Palacio is the author of the novel The Mortifications and the novella How to Shake the Other Man. His work has appeared in the Cincinnati Review, Kenyon Review, Witness, Story Quarterly, and elsewhere. He is a recipient of fellowships from the Black Mountain Institute and Ragdale. All very impressive, right? And it should be enough to let us know that we're in the presence of a writer to pay attention to. And it is enough, sure, but it's not even really close to the whole truth. He left out a few things, such as the fact that The Mortifications was a New York Times Best Book of 2016 and a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. He left out that his short fiction was awarded an O. Henry Award, which honors the 20 best stories out of the approximately 1 billion that are published in the US and Canada each year. He left out that one of his pieces was named a distinguished story in the Best American Short Stories, and that yet more stories won the Florida Review Editors Award and the Puerto del Sol Fiction Prize, that some of what he's published in places like the Colorado Review is actual literal poetry. It might almost make you think that Derek is hiding something. And now that we've snared him and made him move all the way across the country to North Carolina, I will now confess that before I knew him, I really believed he must have been. I was like, what's his deal, really? Somebody who's so accomplished is going to be arrogant and standoffish and protective of his time, right? And then I met him, and he was so instantly easy and funny and really, really, really nice. And so immediately generous and thoughtful with our students. So I thought, what's his deal really? Who's that good? When is the dark side going to come out? And then I saw the dark side, and he wasn't even hiding it. It was all there in his writing the whole time. Derek puts his characters through it. In The Mortifications, for example, he doesn't just make Soledad Encarnacion flee Cuba with her children, leaving her husband Uxbal behind. He makes her flee Cuba and land in icy, gray Hartford, Connecticut, insurance capital of the world. He makes Soledad protect her children by holding her son, Ulysses, hostage against their father. From the text, sewing shears in hand and pressed to his son's jugular. That's all in the first few pages. But he doesn't do it just to torture his characters, or even worse, to torture his readers. Instead, what he does is create very wide borders for his characters' interior and exterior worlds. And then he spends the next few hundred pages patiently and exactingly filling them in. It's big, brave writing, brave enough to allude to Homeric poetry and explore Catholicism and mysticism and exile. And it's confident and skilled enough to tether it all to extremely human, sometimes minute movements and gestures. In fact, that's where I think Derek's bravery is most notable on the page. He's so willing to stay still, something that many writers, myself included, find absolutely terrifying. In his review of The Mortifications in the New York Times, Dinam Gestu wrote, "The narrative may operate on a grand scale, but Palacio is just as gifted a miniaturist, able to distill the unbearable ruptures in a family down to a single image." Dinam Gestu put into words what I felt during Derek's reading here in the spring. I recalled the sense of looking intently at a photograph rather than watching a film. There were gestures to times and places outside of the frame, but it felt like there was an entire narrative built into one moment. And I say I recalled because when I tried to refer to the notes I took during the reading, I found that I'd written almost nothing. I was so enraptured and stilled that I neglected to do anything but listen. That probably means I was derelict in my duties, but I also think it means that we were absolutely brought in the right person for the job. I'm so excited to neglect to do anything but listen again tonight, and I'm even more excited that Derek has joined our community here at UNCG. And with that, I will hand it over to him.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. That was a really generous introduction, and I really appreciate it. I am so grateful to be here with you all, to be at this place, and to have been invited here. So thank you so much for having me. I'd like to say a couple other quick thank yous before I get on with the reading. One to Terry, Jesse, and Michael for setting this up and making it run so smoothly. So thank you for all your efforts to sustain this community effort in difficult times. I'd like to say thank you to all my new colleagues for just being so wonderful and welcoming. I feel really at home here already in Greensboro, and that speaks a lot to this department and the folks in this program. And lastly, I would just like to say thank you to my students in just like their tremendous effort so far in the classroom this term. All of my sessions have been met with energy and joy, and that's hard to do in a program as demanding as this one anyways. So to have that kind of experience under such duress is really impressive. And so thank you. I'm really grateful to work with writers and thinkers of your caliber. So thank you all for that. Tonight I thought I would read from a work in progress, which is called The Confessions. It's a new novel I've been working on for a couple of years now. Hopefully not too many more years. But the novel, The Confessions, is told from the point of view of Miriam Young, and it relates the summer of 1994 that she spends with a swimmer named Daniel Flood at her grandmother Ruth's house on the coast of Connecticut. Miriam has been banished from her home in New York City by her parents, who are unnerved by her recent exploits, which are violent and physical. Unbeknownst to Miriam, Ruth, her grandmother, participated in the Cuban Revolution, which is how she came to know Daniel Flood's grandmother, Sylvia. And it is his grandmother who cares for Daniel in the absence of his mother, Lucia, who's gone at the novel's start missing. Daniel is sent then to Ruth's coastal estate so that he can train without distraction in order to qualify for the Olympic trials. At the start of this section I'm going to share with you tonight, the search for Daniel's mother is intensifying, and the weight of her absence pushes Daniel to make some dangerous decisions while training out in open water. In this excerpt, you'll also hear a direct address, and the speaker, Miriam, is in these instances talking to God, which I don't know if that's clear in the text, but helpful to know ahead of time. But thank you again for everyone who brought me here. Thank you to everyone who's come here to listen. And I really appreciate you giving us your Thursday night. So, The Confessions. The telephone sang. It sang for Daniel, and when he picked it up, it garbled questions at him. Did his mother ever dye her hair? Did she buy tchotchkes when she traveled? Did she have a favorite drink? Might she ever get a tattoo? Where on her body might the needle go? Did she bite her nails? Was she nostalgic, loyal to old haunts? Was she always after something new? Could she move with haste? Was she the kind of woman who made elaborate goodbyes? Did other people ever say she looked like someone they knew? Was that someone famous? Was that someone always an old family member? How good was her memory? Did Lucia like to forget? The telephone hung from the wall to the left of the refrigerator, pearly blue and the only one in the house. It was old, a trim line from the last decade, and the cord had been stretched from the bay window over the kitchen sink to the hallway closet near the front door. The receiver could nearly reach the parlor, which was empty now except for 2 sitting chairs and a reading lamp. You could not sit in either chair and speak on the phone. Daniel took his calls next to the refrigerator, the cord bunched in his free hand like plump seaweed. If the phone rang on his way out the door and down to the beach, he did not pick it up. If it rang at night, he did not pick it up. When he took a call, he did his best to say only yes or no. I never answered, but Ruth, when nearby, would pick up the phone and ask, "What is it?" And after the pause, spit like a curse, "Figure it out." There were different voices on the other end. I could sometimes hear them when walking by, caseworkers at missing persons, detectives from the Hartford PD, a supervisor from such and such department. All men, each tendering the same unmelodious accent, a vocal undertone meant to engender a guarded silence. Their end of the line was a white void into which Daniel cast versions of his mother, and they only ever asked questions. They were forever without answers. The hounds, Ruth said. Do they know something now? I asked. They have scraps. What have they found? Darling, they're bringing out the dead. Women's bodies that have surfaced since Lucia disappeared. The ones who haven't been claimed. The police are just playing telephone right now, reaching out as far as they think Daniel's mother went. It's all white noise. Departments calling departments and seeing if, maybe. If they get one that might be her, they call Daniel or his grandmother. They see if there's something on the body that makes it Lucia's. I said, I didn't think they thought she was dead. They want to know she's not dead before they get out from behind the desks. It seems lazy. It's their job to doubt. One morning, I saw Daniel standing in the hall, the receiver pressed to his hot ear. His face sagged, the skin exhausted, as if he'd spent the call repeating himself. He had the look of a man for whom everyone was suddenly a stranger. I don't know, he said into the phone. She always took a bag to work. I don't know what she kept inside of it. Then, yes, maybe. Then, all right. What was it this time, I asked. He said, a gold chain. Did she wear jewelry? No, he said, I don't think so. He blinked and said, maybe someone gave it to her. There was a towel in his hand and he squeezed it. A blue vein throbbed between two of his knuckles. It's going to storm today, I said. It just won't be rain. The front comes up from the south. White clouds go out into the bay and they come back black. You should be careful. Okay, he said. You have to watch the horizon. Yes. You can't keep your face in the water. If the air changes, I'll feel it, he said. The sound of flesh smashing into flesh. Wet leather lashing itself. I heard it while walking the vegetable dunes above the beach. I remembered my grandmother's words from when Daniel first arrived, immeasurably hurt, and I'd followed him down to the water. He didn't know. I lingered back, gathering reeds and folding them as though it were Easter. In the sand behind me, I left a trail of crosses. I remembered the technique from school, our class curling and pinching palm fronds every March for the nursing homes in the neighborhood. I didn't have to see my hands to do the work. I loved the feel of the reed's edge, which sometimes could be sharp. You could trace your finger along the blade and sense the fibers. I knew just when the plant was about to break the skin. But it surprised me, Daniel's hitting, and I cut my thumb. I made a wispy crimson seam. I'd seen on TV the way some athletes startle their own bodies, runners pounding thighs, boxers tapping their jaws, swimmers shaking their arms as though they might throw them off. A certain amount of pain to jar the nerves from end to end. But Daniel stood shaking on the beach. He faced the water, his long calves tensed into stone, pounding his chest intermittently with both hands, both fists. He dealt with an invisible thing, and I thought it must be something new, something else between him and the water. The thing scared me. It was without rhythm. It was unkin to his other movements. It was not a ritual. Or I was seeing the first instance, the beginning of a ceremony. Daniel hit himself again. His hand bounced back off the muscle of his chest and quaked. Rituals come from loss, from wanting to materialize a dying happening. I wondered what was newly gone. You know very well I fell in love with Daniel Flood at that moment. I don't need to explain what kind of love it was or how it might show itself. You would see how. I understand now that's your ideal, a deep and shape-shifting love, an elastic tissue, ligaments of mercury. You never came upon a person at the end or when they'd finally gripped the kernel of their being. You showed yourself only before the moment. You changed them. I think of Sarah forced into motherhood. I think of the man in the land of Uz, perfect and upright, who came to ruin. I think of your son, who was your spirit, and how at last you thought to bully yourself. You and I share that diamond quality, and I had a sense even then that one could miss a person. I mean, I could have met Daniel later in his life, and he would have already been gone, submerged in the waters of his reactive ambitions beyond the point of touch. But there, standing in the shadow of the water, in the wet sand where the tide drew back, he was still a handful of clay. I knew I would see him move through forms, and you as well, always love the people who let you witness their becoming. But if that afternoon Daniel felt the air change, or the water, or himself, he didn't care. I blinked and he'd stopped hitting himself, was high-stepping into the surf, was diving, was underwater, was a pair of flashing arms in the green swells. He must have noticed something in the current, or he must have felt the same cold gusts bearing down on me, the headwinds of a changing front. But from the shore, even I could see how well he swam atop the water that afternoon, buoyed like a fat tern. He skimmed more than he plowed, and I don't think he wanted to lose the feeling of it. It had nothing to do with work, with training, with logging hours. It was the ecstasy that came from sudden, effortless gliding. He charged like a marlin through the spray, like a water nymph. The temperature, though, dropped slowly but steadily. Clouds gathered, and where the sun still shone through, the glimmering ocean surface turned to steel, to the flash of glinting metal. The sea churned more slowly, sluggish as ice, thickly as rendered fat. Eventually, Daniel sunk into it. I sucked my thumb as it bled, and I held it out into the wind to force the blood to clot and dry. For an hour, Daniel was gone, or I could not see him. He drifted out too far, or I'd been squinting because of the light and the wind, or I'd been distracted, remembering that Esther bit her nails down to the pink. She often had a finger in her mouth. She'd sent me another letter that week, but it seemed old, as if it got lost and only this week found its way to Ruth's house. It said nothing of the wafer, and there was no tape this time, no oily fingerprint where she'd pressed down on the grainy envelope. The note was dithering, an outline of a weekend trip her family had taken upstate to a family camp by a mountain lake with clay tennis courts. The camp was meant to be old-fashioned, and Esther made a list of every silly bit of nostalgia. Adirondack chairs, waiters with black ties tucked in, umbrella drinks, shuffleboard, white shorts, lemonade for the children, campfires, ice boxes, and radios. The script was large and loopy, as if meant to fill the page quickly. I read it several times and then threw it away. Then I retrieved it from the trash, crushed it into a ball, and with a match burned it in the kitchen sink. Some things could be made sacred by destroying them. Some things just turned to ash. I brought with me a red pen and a notebook, and I had the itch to strike at Esther. I wasn't sure I could wait to know she'd eaten the bread. I felt melodramatic then, sitting by the beach and thinking of what might constitute the next love letter. I felt all the smallness of being a teenager, all the stupidness that adults sometimes call innocence. My brain burned thinking of Esther in a tennis court, beating her mother in singles and then laughing it away, letting go of the power she had. She did that sort of thing, enact the forces of her body and then release them. It was something I hated of her, and I was surprised to learn you could hate something of the person you loved, and I wish she took herself more seriously. It was sometimes as if she unknew herself, and it bothered me because we were deep into a shared revelation, or so I believed. She treated herself lightly, as dust and shadow, and it was a weakness for me, worrying she would treat me the same. I took out my notebook and I began to describe Daniel to Esther. I didn't mention his name at first. I said there was a boy who swam at my grandmother's house. In fact, he lived in the room down the hall from me. He walked around shirtless, and I saw frequently his dark chest. The sun had gotten him right away. He was on the water daily for hours. He walked out into the water gingerly. He still, even after weeks, did not trust the sandy ocean floor, knew that at places it was sharp with life, lobsters and sand dollars, hermit crabs, driftwood splintered and dark. I was watching him at that very moment, or I was watching after him. He'd gone under, which he could do silently. He knew so well how his body worked. He could hold his breath for minutes, could descend into the bruised waters and twirl there. It didn't strain him at all. When he held his breath, His face was calm and placid, and his jaw set delicately into his skull. A bubble sometimes escaped his thick lips, but it was as if he breathed from some other part of his body. Gills under his arms, or down his back, or the soft skin behind his knees, somewhere behind his sunburned ears. His name is Daniel, I wrote, and he's just a little older than us. He staggered out of the water as I wrote his name. His skin had gone gray, the tips of his fingers white. He moved slowly, did not seem to have the strength to walk, and his chest shivered. He sat down in the sand, and then he leaned against an arm, and then he drifted downward. He wilted, his limbs going slack, dying extra in a movie, and his head, bouncing against the ground, turned to the side. I could see his blue lips. I could see his red tongue. Ruth only had to touch him to know. I'd run to the house and called for her, and she'd emerged from her bedroom in faded jeans and a cream blouse, looking clean and natural. As she moved, I thought she was beautiful. And only later did I understand how clearly a person comes into focus when they perform their talents. There is some truth in the action that can't be gotten otherwise, and I had never seen Ruth perform as a doctor before, as an expert on the body. She moved quickly but did not run down to the beach. I told her that Daniel was blue, and she plucked a blanket from a closet in the hall. On the beach, she touched Daniel's arm, and I saw something flash between them, a bit of white light. And it was, perhaps, the recognition of how precarious the moment was. But Ruth said his name softly, Daniel, Daniel, and wrapped him in the blanket while waiting for him to speak. His mouth moved, and she said, excellent, my darling, wonderful. Say it again. I was close, but I hadn't heard anything. Ruth pulled Daniel up. Slowly, I would later learn, because too much speed could disrupt the heartbeat, and told me to sit with him, to rub his back and hold him close. Put your face on his, she said. I did as I was told, slipping to the ground and pressing my body up against his slumping mass. His cheekbones, low and round, rolled into the flesh of my face, and I took my glasses off, dropping them into the sand. His closed eye rested against my skin, and when he blinked, I could feel the lashes lashing. I couldn't see the water anymore, or really the house behind us. I had the impression that I was alone with something inhuman. I don't know how Ruth managed to drive the Jeep down to the water. Years of walking up and down the shore, I can only imagine. But she wound the boxy truck over the northern grass and pulled it up slowly to our bodies. She emerged, still radiant and full of blinding, focused energy. Because we stuck to one another, I felt as though all my heat had drained into him. Ruth moved us as one person, her hands on both our shoulders, pushing our conjoined selves gently into the back seat. She drove and spoke on the way to the clinic, asking Daniel, where does your body end? What's the last bit you feel? The Old Line Clinic was staffed only for the summer, chock-a-block with rolling drawers, shoddily hung needle bins marked hazard. As they put Daniel onto a bed, hot water bags and blankets tumbled from the stores. A slow pulse hit his veins and made it hard for the needle to plumb a beck. By the bed, a dangling, unhurried saline, ready to drip like warm clay. Daniel had stopped shaking, was cold beyond tremors. His body neared a whiteness that was terrifying. It looked like a disease. It spread from his hands up past his arms and around his neck. I started to cry when they pushed me out of the room. I could hear all the nurses chattering, asking those questions that medical professionals ask themselves rhetorically when confronting someone's carelessness. They weren't like Ruth, who I could hear through the curtains speaking to Daniel still, her tone somehow full of pride, as if he'd won the race. The nurses mumbled sideways, shaking their heads and wondering aloud, what was he doing out there? Didn't he feel the water? Someone said, like those idiot surfers. And she meant the young men, mostly, who stormed the beach in October. Black-bodied in wetsuits, they chased an abnormal surf, sometimes churned by southern hurricanes, the winds lapping northward. One nurse, her tiny snow mouth pursed, said, well, he doesn't belong out there. And she saw me glaring. I said softly, fuck you, and she went back to work, trudging more blankets and bottles into and out of the curtain void. I wanted to cut her face. Ruth emerged from the drapery and came to me. We seemed suddenly the same height, as though we took up the same space. I was not sure if I had shrunk or if she'd grown. When she held my hand in hers, I could tell she'd been touching some part of Daniel's body. Her fingertips were cold and hard, bits of ice. She grasped his shoulder and cradled his head. Her hands took my wrists, and all the hairs on my arm stiffened. "He will be fine," she said. "Yes? Yes. Now listen." I turned my head towards the curtains, and in the minutes to come, all the nurses drained from the enclosure. A clicking noise arose, ticking upward in the silence that followed the rush. It was a steady whirring. There was a rhythm to the machine, and you could say it sounded like a heartbeat, or you could say it was artificial, empty of life as an incessant clock. "They're warming his blood now," Ruth said. "They've got a good line into his hand. The contraction works like a dialysis machine. It takes the blood out, heats it a little, and then sends it carefully back into the body. The warm blood is going to work its way through every limb. All of it will pass through his heart. He's going to be heated from the inside out. He'll have to rest, but he'll be fine in the end. Do you hear me? He will be fine. You did a marvelous job holding him. Let's get you a blanket and some coffee. I want to go look at him." "Not yet," Ruth said. He's very pale yet. He's tired. We'll wait a bit, and all the color will be back, in his hands and his face. Walk with me." From her pocket, Ruth pulled out a pair of tan glasses, my glasses. She handed them to me. She must have plucked them from the sand. "How long was he out there, darling?" Ruth asked. "An hour, I think." Good, she said. She found another blanket from somewhere and wrapped me in it. She fetched me a cup of black coffee, and she rubbed my shoulders and massaged my neck. She kissed me on the ear. "He's very strong," she said. "You're both very strong. Drink that slow. I have to go and call Daniel's grandmother." My stomach lurched at the hot coffee, and I had no appetite. I watched Ruth at the nurse's station borrow a phone and dial a number from memory. I couldn't hear her voice, and her lips themselves looked cold, somewhat purple, and they moved mechanically. If it was Sylvia she spoke to, I wondered how Ruth kept her grace. I thought maybe she wanted to deliver the news evenly, to distance herself from the event, which was no one's fault but Daniel's. But her skin glowed differently from before, and a tremor worked its way up to the surface. Daniel was out of her hands, and Ruth had put aside her energies. Now she had to wait, along with Sylvia and me, which is to say she would also suffer. And so the call was quick. When Ruth hung up, she waited a moment, staring down at the nurse's station. She wrung her hands, twice pressing her thumbs into the soft meat of her palms. She looked then over her shoulder and into Daniel's room. She said something to a nurse troubling paperwork nearby. She pointed at the clock. The nurse checked her own watch. Ruth waved her off and went to Daniel. In a moment, she escaped the curtains with 3 hot water bottles in hand. She forced them into the arms of the nurse, and I heard her say, "It's been half an hour. There's no heat left in them." "He'll be all right," the nurse said. "The Lord doesn't want him today." A silver cross hung from her neck. "God doesn't kill anyone," Ruth answered. "It's the person who dies." Ruth abandoned the nurse, marching back to our chairs and drawing close the collar of her shirt. After she sat down, I asked her, "Is Daniel trying to kill himself? Is that why you said that to the nurse?" "Some people think children are brimming with the stuff of life," she said, "that you all can't imagine dying. What do you think of that?" "I think Daniel's thought of dying," I said. "Do you think he would have come ashore if he didn't want to live?" "No. Neither do I. They won't ask those questions. And to them, it's a mistake. This is just a body shop. They want to revive him. If he can breathe on his own, he can warm himself again, then they're done. They don't see how the mind and the body are often alone from one another." "But was he trying to go under? You've watched him swimming, haven't you?" I blushed. "Yes." "Do you think he gets in the water without knowing why?" "No." "And how does he feel about his grandmother? You think he forgot about her this morning?" "I think he loves her very much," I said, "maybe more so than his mother." "Say what you mean by that." just that he would never hurt her. I think he could hurt his mother, but not his grandmother. Yes, Ruth said. I think that's exactly right. Daniel is full of loves, different kinds of love. There's no chance of his going. It will keep him even when he doesn't want to be kept. I looked up at Ruth and she smiled at me. I'm sure she saw the confusion on my face, my inability to know what she meant. She touched my ear and then she stroked my hair. She held a rope of it in my hand. He is lucky, Ruth said. Lucky, lucky. When I woke, the clinic was dark. I found the paper cup still in my hand, coffee dregs dried in a splotchy ring at the bottom. Across my sticky tongue moved a plastic film. A pinch ached in my neck as if a tack had been pushed into the space between my vertebrae. I was alone, but I could hear a voice. It was Ruth, and it came from inside the curtain's tomb. She was with Daniel, and she told him a story. It was one of the few times in my life I was grateful for having grown up Catholic. Everything we love in the church, or I should say everything we celebrate, demands our waiting. We wait for the birth of the child all through December, and then just a few months later, we wait for him to die. Then we wait for the fire to touch our foreheads. Our favorite thing to do is wait. I hated Lent the most. I hated fasting and waiting all day for food. The other children got tired, but it always gave me a nervous energy. I was popping out of my school chair, and the nuns were quick with their sticks. At my school, at least in my time, the nuns weren't interested in symbolic sacrifice. Do you know what they used to do? We still brought the same lunches to school during Lent, the same brown bags bulging with sandwiches and apples and treats. But at lunchtime, we'd spread our food on the desks, and the nuns would walk by. They'd look over a meal, and then they would subtract. No sandwich today, just the carrots and the milk, or just an apple cut in half between breakfast and dinner. And during Holy Week, just a carton of milk between morning and afternoon. But I loved fish then, all the cheap white fish. I loved the deadly crossed gold with oil, the dripping bottom. It's got to be hot to the touch, scalding. Sometimes I would move to the back of the line at the Friday dinners, those old eat-ups the knights corralled. We'd all cram the church basement, stink it down to hell with tartar and red sauce. But I'd wait till I knew the first platters were cleared out, till the cooks were rushing to bread and fry more cod. Multiply, multiply, big joke. Then it would stray from the vats onto your plate, and you could tear a piece, bite it quick, and burn your tongue before getting back to your table. That is a hard satisfaction to replace. And after high school, I wasn't going to force myself to drink milk for a week. After high school, the fish never tasted the same. It never amounted to so much. I suppose I got older. But the salt and the oil, that's what we waited for at the end of those long, hungry weeks. I'm starved just remembering. But those friends we waited for, they were coming from Mexico by boat. It wasn't a big boat, and they knew a lot of things, but only one of them really knew anything about boats. Just one old Navy man in the whole group. They overloaded the little diesel with too many supplies, and they brought too many comrades. The cruiser was 20 years old. It had no business crossing channels with its cranky engines and its seeping cracks. We should have known we'd have to wait for them. It was always a prayer. They couldn't stay in Mexico, but we should have known that at some point we'd all think they'd gone under. Every one of them drowned at sea. We planned for many things. But some realities, even imagined ones, are beyond preparation. I was fortunate because there were things still to be done. Bundles of medicine to gather and drop, rounds to make through the mountains. I went to patients whom I'd visited before who were a thread in the fabric of my routine. Others had to drink coffee and smoke cigarettes to pass the hours, sometimes in the dark. Others had to wait for the word, like the congregation at Mass. I got to be a priestess, or maybe I'm remembering it that way because I also visited some churches. I was also working with some priests at the time. But I could move about, and my own freedom, this is something, Daniel, I think you understand, was a salve for the placelessness of those we waited for, the missing. I scurried here and there with bandages and iodine and home-sewn tourniquets. I left those 100 packages in 100 different places. I think some of them must still be there, thin and rotten by now, but still waiting in the hollows, those tree wounds that look like misplaced mouths. And even when a day had passed, when we'd heard along the radio wires that our friends were dead, I went out in my rain jacket, hiding more mana for the lost. I mean to say that you've been doing it the right way, Daniel. Waiting is a gift of hours and minutes. You can burn them, or you can purify yourself with them. You've been taking the long bath, and I think that's wonderful. Waiting is a burden for those without imagination, for those who can't imagine the need to touch, in anticipation, that future self. I know you think she's dead. I know you think the news is just slow to come, and I know you are preparing. The water must be another muscle by now. Surely you feel it that way. You've let the currents into your veins. You could swim in your sleep. Your body would know exactly what to do. We know that if the news does come, if we get the terrible word, that it will cripple your heart, at least for a time. But you've trained your legs and arms to keep moving. You will be able to swim afterwards, which means you know a little bit of that person already, the young man whose mother has died. You are the miracle. Ruth stopped then, and I felt suddenly the wetness on my face. I wanted very badly to touch my grandmother and to look into her eyes. I had the sense that they were wide open, that all the light there was poured into them, and the glow gathered at the bottom, illuminating the depths. If I could look, I'd see the bedrock, the layer of earth upon which Ruth had been built. Thank you all very much for being here again. Thank you all for listening. I think we'll have a final card come up that talks about our next reading by Janine Capo-Cruzet in a couple weeks. So please join us then. And again, thank you all for being here and have a wonderful weekend. Take care.